All right, check. Check's good. This 40 Ounce Hemlock Podcast, this is episode 42, wherein we are going to be having a discussion, however summarical, however introductory, however brief, but we are going to have this promised discussion of what I have been calling the science writer and the cultural purpose to which the science writer, as you will become familiar with them, is employed and deployed. All right?
Look here, said Featherstone. Let me run you across tomorrow to see John Wither. He told me to bring you for the weekend if you were interested. You'll meet all the important people there, and it'll give you a chance to make up your mind. Well, how does Wither come into it? I thought Jules was the head of the NICE. Jules was a distinguished novelist and scientific popularizer whose name always appeared before the public in connection with the new institute. Jules? Hell's bells, said Featherstone. You don't imagine that little mascot has anything to say to what really goes on? He's all right for selling the institute to the great British public in the Sunday papers, and he draws a whacking salary. He's no use for work. There's nothing inside his head except some 19th century socialist stuff and blah about the rights of man. He's just about got as far as Darwin.
All right, look. This show has lost the polish. It's lost the pristine. It's lost. I just throw shit in now. I don't got the time to try to be all hosty, podcast hosty. I don't have the time to try to be all entertaining. I don't have the time for that shit. I don't even have the time to coordinate, well thought out interludes and transitions. I'm just like, here, throw that in there. This kind of talks about what I'm talking about. Look, if you're going to, as the Democrat Party and as liberals, and God, I hate to call them liberals, but as these folks are at pains to do, if your goal is to bring the public under the sway of this notion that one party in this country is uniquely aligned with science, and another political party in this country is uniquely at odds with science. One thing that's useful to you is to have journalists or writers of a sort out there in the public writing articles and doing pieces for public consumption that further this narrative and this notion. And this is the person that I call the science writer. There's innumerable types, or there's innumerable examples of this. One that springs to mind is that Chris Mooney guy that wrote that book, The Republican Brain. All right. There's just a lot of folks out there who are quietly writing little suggestive articles that come across your radar, and if you look closely at these articles, we're going to look closely at one or two of them here. If you look closely at these articles, what you will come to understand is that what they are doing is they are trying to use the putative neutrality of science and the putative objectivity of science and their suggested alignment with that objectivity and neutrality to dislodge you from your putatively biased position as a conservative, as a Republican, as a Christian, as a whatever. I don't use those terms interchangeably, but at times they are interchangeable for certain purposes. All right? To be a Christian is not to be a Republican. To be a Republican is not to be a conservative. But there are some times when all of the relevant aspects of those belief structures coalesce for certain purposes of discussion, okay? And they do here. All right? So we're clear? All right, good. I don't want anybody writing me and being like, you just assume that. All right, that's not the point. All right? I'm a Christian. I'm a conservative. I'm a Republican. And as a Christian, I sometimes disagree with conservatives. And as a conservative, I oftentimes disagree with Republicans. So obviously, as the philosophers say, the three come apart. Okay, they come apart. But there are also points where their purposes and the societal trends and the climate within the culture affects them all similarly, because the knives that are out that are aimed at them are aimed at all of them, or are aimed at some property that they all share. Okay? Okay. Now, the science writer. I said in From Darwin to Donald Trump that the putative or the presumed neutrality and objectivity of science is very useful to the left, is very useful to Democrats, and which these days are Marxists. All right. Because they want you to believe that to oppose them is to be biased. To oppose them is to oppose objective learning and knowledge and science and so forth. And so they try to align their positions with science. And I should say more than align. They try to identify, as the philosophers say, to identify A with B is to say that A is identical to B. Okay? They try to identify their positions with science in order to then castigate you if you should oppose them or their positions as being, you guessed it, anti-science. Or, you don't know how science works. Right? How often have you heard that? You don't know how science works, by the little snot-nosed Gestapos. All right? This is perhaps, I don't want to say the most potent weapon in their arsenal, but it might be. I want to talk to you about the science writer. I know I talked to you a little bit about the science writer in those first 10 episodes, especially the middling episodes of those first 10 episodes, like episodes 4, 5, and 6, or 5, 6, and 7, or something like that. But I want to talk to you more about the science writer here. All right? And to do so, I'm going to give you some examples of what I'm talking about.
Of course we're non-political. The real power always is. I don't believe you can do that, said Mark. Not with the papers that are read by educated people. Well, that shows you're still in the nursery, lovey, said Miss Hardcastle. Haven't you yet realized that it's the other way round? How do you mean? Why, you fool, it's the educated reader who can be gulled. All our difficulty comes with the others. When did you meet a workman who believes the papers?
The deplorables.
Takes it for granted that they're all propaganda and skips the leading articles. He buys his paper for the football results and the little paragraphs about girls falling out of windows and corpses found in Mayfair flats. He is our problem. We have to recondition him. But the educated public, the
he
people
is our
who
problem.
read the highbrow weeklies, don't need reconditioning.
We
They're
have to
all right already.
recondition
They'll
him.
believe anything. As one of the class you mentioned said,
All right. So how do they recondition him? How do they get at him? Well, I'm one of him. I'm a deplorable. And one of the ways they get at me is through these little articles in my Firefox browser that come up via pocket.org or pocket.com or whatever this little, or getpocket.com or whatever this like sort of like pseudo quasi intellectual news story aggregator is that populates my opening browser window with a bunch of stories that I then turn around and say, oh, I should use that for my podcast. All right. I want to give you an example of this. The first one I'm going to give you is not directly from that aggregator that I'm referring to here, but it manifests all the characteristics that I want to identify in these things generally. Okay. Quite a while ago. What was that? Was that a car horn? Good Lord. I'm in a basement here. Sorry. Quite a while ago. Just after our previous president, whoever that guy was, I don't like to talk about that guy's name. I don't like to mention that guy's name. Not for reasons of spite or malice or anything like that. I just don't know his name. I just don't know it. All right? Guy went, apparently, in the course of his multifaceted existence, some of which is documented by official birth papers and some of which is not, right? The guy went by a lot of names, so I have just chosen personally just a personal decision, and who can disrespect a personal decision, right? It's just personal. I've just chosen to not call the guy by his name, or I try not to, because it confuses me, it confuses everybody else. That guy confuses people with all his names, so I just say that previous president. All right. Now, just after he was elected, in a British newspaper called The Guardian, there was an article. I don't know how I happened across this article. I think what happened was I was a graduate student studying philosophy at the time, studying the philosophy of mind. I mean, that's my area, and I saw some article that seemed to gesture at my area of study, my area of concentration, my area of expertise, and I was like, let me read this. And what it ended up being for me was a sort of wake-up call, in a sense, to how as we heard in that clip a moment ago, the scientific popularizers, the science writers, all right, are using the putative or purported findings of science, which they're not, they're nothing of the sort, are using the putative or purported findings of science to move or nudge the public in the direction of liberalism, leftism, Democratic Party, etc., and so on and so forth. I want to just read a little bit of this to you because, again, like I said a moment ago, I think that what this article does is that it exemplifies several of the key characteristics of what I'm calling, for lack of a better phrase, the science writer setup. Okay? So it appeared in this British paper, The Guardian, okay, and it was written by some, enthusiastic science writer or columnist. And the gist of this piece was that some new or startling discovery in the, I'm going to put this in quotes now, in the brain sciences was just about to change everything we knew about all the relevant stuff we were all concerned about, okay? Now, I say that this piece exemplifies a lot of what I'm at pains to point out here. I want to say more specifically that not all of the, quote, science writer, end quote, pieces that I'm going to want to, capture under this umbrella, not all of them have to do with the mind and the brain, okay? The mind and the brain were my area of concentration, my area of specialization, my area of expertise in graduate school, my area of study. It's what I did all my work and writing and thinking about during those very poverty-stricken, unproductive years. They're productive in some sense, and yet in the real relevant human sense, they were extraordinarily unproductive, right? Because I just got in a lot of debt. I'll be starting a Patreon channel soon. They got in a lot of debt, and learned a bunch of stuff, but other than that, what was the point? Well, I guess there is a point because now I can share this stuff with you. So not all of them are about the mind and the brain. This one is. But what they all share is a certain sort of a setup, a certain sort of purpose and structure and cadence and general method. Okay? And that's what I want to talk to you about here. Okay? Now, I want to lock in and zoom in or whatever. I want to focus in. I want to narrow in on this expression that we just identified from this article, brain sciences, okay? And like I said, all these science writer articles that I'm going to talk about and sort of capture under this large tent, they're not all about the brain and the mind, okay? That was my area, but they all share the common method of this piece that we're going to review here, okay? But since we are talking about the brain and the mind, in this instance, in our first sort of paradigmatic instance of the science writer setup that I want to share with you, what I need you to know is that anyone, and please hear me when I say this, because, man, this is one of those things where if you're inside this world, you're like, how could anybody think? And if you're outside this world, you just don't know. You just don't know. Okay, so I'm going to try to share with you something from inside this world that this writer from outside this world, who is presuming to share the inside world with you, the outside world, is trying to pass over on you, that is just nonsense, okay? Anyone who has taken just a few turns through the corridors of the history of philosophy knows that there is a single, all right? A single argument. I don't mean argument like back and forth, like yes he did, no he didn't. We're talking about philosophy here. Argument, like an argumentative proposition, like a series of statements that are meant to suggest a conclusion, right? Okay? Everyone knows that there's a single argument or thought experiment, whatever you want to call it, a single one put forward by a German philosopher back in the 1700s, 1800s, whatever, that shows that this whole shtick, this whole routine, this whole pretense, this whole whatever you want to call it, of learning about the mind from the, quote, brain sciences, end quote, is a charade. Okay? I know you don't know that, or, there might be a few among you listening to this show precisely because of what this show is about and it's stuff that interests you and you have sort of prior knowledge of it. But most of you don't. I'm telling you, there is a single argument with all the force of what the philosophers call a knockdown, fatal, final argument that shows that every article you might read that says, hey, brain sciences are telling us this about the mind is bullshit. Okay? There was a philosopher in Germany named Leibniz, whatever. And he's famous for giving this argument to the following effect. And this argument, like all the great ones, functions in the way of a sort of a thought experiment. A thought experiment is where someone says like, hey, well, if what we're trying to figure out is this, well, then just imagine if this, and this were the case, and then that would show that the conditions were met for the thing that you're saying is possible, but you would see that this still, right? It's a thought experiment. It's not like we're at the Bunsen burner and the test tubes and the science table, right? We're not there like doing the experiment, but we're thinking through a way that would test what's being said, and it comes out false. Okay? It's called a thought experiment. There was a German philosopher who was like, okay, look, guys, I know everybody is very tempted to think that the mind is the brain and the brain is the mind. And when we're talking about one, we're talking about the other. And when we're talking about the other, we're talking about the one. But, said Leibniz, let me just quick give you a very obvious, and this is the thing about thought experiments, sometimes they reveal a conclusion that is so obvious that it's hard to believe that it's true, but it's true because it's so obvious, right? It's like, that's the genius of a thought experiment, is it reveals a truth that is sometimes so simple that it's, well, the sophisticated philosophers reject it because it's just too simple. Things have to be harder than that, right? Leibniz was like, look, if anyone's truly convinced that the mind of a person... Now, hey, let me pause here for a second. Why are we talking about the mind? Is this just a preoccupation of Nick, here at the 40 Ounce Hemlock podcast? Because he's just hung up on his area of graduate study and is trying to make it relevant, to like... He's just living in the past, or is it just like he's trying to like just do something with what he learned about in graduate school and he needs to just move on and like study Java programming and forget all this shit? It's like, no. Listen, the mind is what makes you unique as a person. It's what makes a person. It's what sets a person off from the rest of the inanimate world, the animal world, from all other metaphysical categories. It's the mind. It matters what we say the mind is, because that determines how strong is the distinction between you and the rest of the world. Now, the political left, the Democrats, the liberals, whatever you want to call them, the Marxists, the socialists, the collectivists, I don't care. They have for a long time, since Darwin and before, very much wanted you to believe that there is nothing really distinct between you and the rest of the world. That you somehow just kind of, ooze out of the rest of the world. Just grow out of the rest of the world. Just evolve out of the rest of the world. And therefore, whatever your mind is, it does that too. Your mind is just a sort of like souped up version of a raccoon mind, which is just a sort of souped up version of a rat mind, which is just a sort of souped up version. See the point? There's nothing really distinct about it. It's just bigger and better, and it evolved to be bigger and better. Okay? The mind is really important, because for the left, that's how they are going to get the change in society that they want. To get people to accept a totally different type of political organization, namely socialism or communism, you have to convince them that they are a totally different type of thing. And to convince a society that they are a totally different type of thing than they actually are, you have to convince the individual members of the society that they are a totally different thing than heretofore they had supposed they were. All right? And to do that, you have to address their nature, and our nature as humans is the nature of thinking beings. So you have to address what they think about their mind, its origin, its capabilities, its limits, its story of origination, and so on and so forth. Okay? This is the marriage between evolution and communism. The communists found evolution, and you can see this in Marx's writings to his friends and colleagues and stuff. The Marxists found evolution extraordinarily useful to serve their purposes. Okay? So Leibniz had this argument, and it was knocked down, and it was perfect, and it was fatal. It was all the things that philosophers both love and hate an argument to be. They love it because that's what they're striving for. They hate it because it ends the debate. They want to keep having the debate. Okay? Leibniz recommended that if we were truly convinced that the mind was a physical thing, in other words, the brain, then, well, we should just imagine ourselves being so small as to be able to walk inside the thing. You know, like just into the ear or something. As we might walk inside a factory. Okay? Hey, stay with this. This is super important. Now, upon doing so, we'd see many things, just like one sees when one walks into a factory of various sorts, right? We might see like machinery, pumping pistons, pulsating tubes, valves, churning cranks, bursts of compressed vapor, and so forth, right? Right? And you might be like, Nick, no, we're talking about the brain. You'd see like neurons and stuff. Yes, the point is that all that stuff is machinery. It's all physical stuff, right? That's what we'd see. In short, as Leibniz identified, we would see all sorts of mechanism at work, right? Now, the crucial point of his thought experiment lies, however, precisely in what we would not see. What would we not see? We would not see, oh, folks, people who, folks, please hear me when I say this. Please just pause it and go into a quiet room and listen. Or something. If the kids are around, like, please listen to this. This is so profound. This is the way all great philosophical arguments are. This is so profound as to be easily missed because it's just so poignant and profound that you just think, well, it seems so obvious that you don't really realize all that's lurking underneath as the consequence of this. Okay? What would we not see? We wouldn't see a thought. We wouldn't see a perception. We wouldn't see a memory. We wouldn't see a hope. We wouldn't see an act of faith, right? We wouldn't see a desire. We wouldn't see any mental images, any of that. Why wouldn't we see that? Because those are all things that are described in mental, psychological language, and they have no obvious connection with the physical language that we describe the brain in. Right? You don't see, if you put a guy on like a CAT scan or an MRI, you don't see that a hope or a desire or a fear, you don't see that one of those things is a set of neurons firing. You assume it is because they happen at the same time or relevantly proximate to each other temporally, right? So Leibniz is like, you're not going to see any of that stuff. And so to say, given that those things are what thinking consists in, and those things are the paramount paradigmatic examples of the mental things we're trying to explain, it is absurd to say that the mind is the brain, because if we looked closely at the brain, no matter how precise our instruments, no matter how closely we zoomed in, we'd never see any of those things. You'd just see more machinery. But those things aren't machinery. Those things are hopes and desires and images and all those things, right? There's another thing we wouldn't see, and this is crucial. This is the capstone. This is, I don't know whether to say this is more crucial than the other things, or this is the other things are not as crucial as they are. But listen, there's another thing we wouldn't see. We would not see the person, the subject for whom those thoughts obtained. That thing, in other words, the you who has those thoughts, that would be nowhere in sight. Literally. All right? Now, why do I bring that up here? Because some science writer in The Guardian a few years back wanted you to know that there have been some amazing discoveries in the brain sciences that are going to change everything you thought you knew about yourself. And what I'm here to tell you is that when someone writes an article like this, they are trying to reconfigure your self-conception so it is more at home with a political philosophy that they want you to accept. And 99 times out of 10, yes, I see what I did there. Do you? 99 times out of 10, that is socialism or collectivism that they want you to accept. Now listen. Oh, you know what I should also say here? It's not just that this argument was popular back in the 18th century, whatever, with Leibniz, back in the Enlightenment. It has a grandchild in our own day. This argument does. A very famous, like if you study philosophy at the undergrad level, like you are sure to encounter this argument, okay? And it has all the force that it did back then, and people talk about it and debate it endlessly in the way that they did Leibniz's argument back then. Okay, it's the same argument. It's just reconfigured for modern times, right? It's called the explanatory gap argument. And it essentially says that you could explain everything there was to explain and identify everything there was to identify about brain events at whatever level of granularity, at whatever level of nuance, however far you zoomed in with the electron microscope or whatever, or the CAT scan or the MRI or whatever the tool is. It says no matter what you did with those tools and how close you looked, you would never be able to explain why some mental event occurred, like the thought of your grandmother, or the mental image of an orange, or your hope on the resurrection of Jesus Christ, or, see what I mean? Those are mental events. Nothing about the brain activity would ever remotely suggest those things. They're utterly unlike. See, they're unlike, and therefore there is an explanatory gap between them. Okay? The argument's called the explanatory gap. Back in Leibniz's day, back in the Enlightenment, back then it was called Leibniz's factory or Leibniz's mill, because he imagined you walking inside of it and seeing all the mechanism, right? Same thing. It is just the sort of argument that is, well, I'll tell you from personal experience, it's rousing to the ardent undergraduate, precisely because the ardent undergraduate is not the sort of person, like his professor perhaps, whose entire research project in like cognitive science maybe might be called into question by the argument's conclusion. Now, of course, the professor will no doubt explain that he's not roused by it precisely because it's not as strong of an argument as one might initially presume. But what else would you expect from a person whose entire research project and associated grants and funding are completely undermined by one simple argument? All right. Again, the explanatory gap argument just casually points out, just like Leibniz casually pointed out, that no amount of information about what is going on in someone's brain could ever, never, ever allow us to infer or deduce or induce or abduce or derive or whatever, anything about what's going on in the person's mind. Period. As the philosophers say, full stop. Endless description of brain events, endless study of brain events, endless recording of brain events, no matter the sophistication of the device, no matter how precise or exhaustive, would not, could not, will not, in the very nature of the case, ever legitimate or license an inference to the content of the mental events. And this is so precisely because, just as Leibniz said, brain events, and this is so simple you're just not going to believe, brain events are nothing like mental events. You can't infer from the one to the other because they're nothing like the other, right? My thought of my grandmother is nothing like a bunch of sizzling neurons. So you could, no matter how close you got to those sizzling neurons and looked at them and inspected them and noted which ones were sizzling, whether it was 99 through 1 million, which one, you could index them, you could, right? It doesn't matter. Until I laid there on the table and told you, I'm thinking of my grandmother, and then you drew the correlation from what you were seeing on the brain scan to the thought of Nick's grandmother, right? You could never associate the two unless I told you that's what I was thinking of. Paul says in the New Testament, no one knows the thoughts of a man except for the spirit of the man that is within him. All right? Let that sink in. The argument is crushing in its simplicity. No matter how many neurons are firing, when I think of my grandmother, it remains the case that neurons firing are nothing like the thought of my grandmother. Therefore, the scientist or the researcher or the lab worker or whatever who's staring at the MRI scan or whatever he's staring at, the CAT scan or whatever, they could never, ever tell me or know what I was thinking about unless I told them. Okay? The one is not like the other. Now, why are we talking about this again? Because this proves that every single article that pops up in your face on your phone, on your computer, right? Every single one that's like, new discoveries in the brain sciences will tell us all about... No, they don't. No, they don't. No one knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of the man that is in him. It's tempting, I know people bristle at this because they think, well, but we've had all this progress. We've had all this research. It's tempting to try to reply that, I don't know, the Apostle Paul, like Aristotle, for instance, they just had no idea that an investigation into the brain would reveal the thoughts of a man, as we now know is the case. But that's the point. We don't know that now. So all these science writers that are suggesting it to you are, stop me if you've heard this one, lying to you. It's a joke when I say stop me if you've heard this one. It's because I say this all the time on this on this show, okay? This is precisely why the explanatory gap argument has attained the level of conundrum that it has. And now, as I think I gestured at a minute ago, some modern philosophers have even secured this problem's Hall of Fame status by doing what all self-deceived theorists do when they find an insoluble problem. They've decided that, well, perhaps it's no problem at all. No, not because they found a solution, but precisely because they can't. All right. So, having done a little gloss, as they say, of the history of philosophy there, gathering and garnering the relevant parts for our point here, let's come back to the brain science article in the British newspaper written by a science writer. All right. This author who wrote this piece has, if you read it, startling news for us about what's happening in cognitive science. News that, of course, is going to have just fantastic implications for, some domain that we would have never imagined had this author not so faithfully discharged her task in this week's column. In fact, the title of the piece itself spells out the whole routine so obviously that there's little left to say by way of commentary. The title reads as follows. It says, "In control? Think again. Our ideas of brain and human nature are myths." That's the main caption. And then the subcaption underneath says, "The notion of individual autonomy underpins our society. Yet new research suggests that this guiding principle is an illusion." All right, really let that sink in. And in order to help you let it sink in, I'm going to explain it a little bit. What does it mean by individual autonomy? Well, look, the debate about whether the mind is the brain is closely tied to the debate about whether you as a being are capable of making free decisions of your own volition or not. Here's why. If the mind just is the brain, well, the brain is just like any other physical object in the universe, like a baseball or like this can of Pepsi Blue Ribbon I'm drinking, or, it's just a physical object. And as such, it's enacted upon by other physical objects according to the laws of physics. It doesn't have any power of itself to do anything except that something else act upon it. So if the mind is the brain, well, then you're just sort of a cog in a big wheel. You just have not heretofore imagined the scope, the radius, the hubcap diameter of that wheel, right? However, if, like Leibniz, and before him, like Descartes, and before him, like the Apostle Paul, right? If what they say about the mind is true, namely that it is not material, that it is not the brain, that it is more of a spirit that is attached to the material body, and as such, being a non-material thing, it's not subject to the laws that govern material things, namely the laws of physics, well, then we can sort of see, if only negatively, how it could have its own ability to act of its own volition, because it's not governed by the laws of physics. Does that make sense? So what this author is telling you is that new discovery, now having said that, listen, new discoveries in the cognitive sciences have shown us that what? Individual autonomy, the notion that underpins our whole society, i.e., Western society, i.e., Protestant Christian society, i.e., capitalism, i.e., free society, i.e., the civil society. Do you see? New research in the cognitive sciences now show us that all of that, based on that singular notion of individual autonomy, all of that is bullshit. That guiding principle is an illusion. So what should we do? Well, you're going to see in a minute. We should all become socialists. Do you see how this works? Science is used, it is employed, it is deployed. Faulty science is used, it is employed, it is deployed. Faux science, pseudoscience, as they like to say, is used, deployed, employed, in order to move you away from your intuitions that your way of life are the correct way of life. Oh, who's this? Hi. Hey, come here. Come here. Can you come here for a second? What do you need? Tell me about it. Come here. Claire Elaine. Come here. Okay. What do you need?
I need the...
Do you need a hair tie?
Yes.
But you have one in your hand. And Daddy put up your hair before now. Oh, Mommy did this one, huh? What do you need?
I need this that I to put on.
Did you get that off Mama's desk?
Yes.
Okay, we'll take it upstairs. I'll be up in just a little bit, okay?
Okay.
I love you.
You love me too.
I love you too.
Mommy loves me too.
Yes. Okay. All right. Do you see? The subcaption is the notion of individual autonomy that underpins our society is an illusion. All right. And then after this, of course, because it's just the title, comes the author's intro, which is laced with personal narrative about how she herself had been utterly unaware of all this before, stumbling upon some books about brains at the local bookstore. Books, as she says, about how it all works and how we think. Now, I hope you know from our series From Darwin to Donald Trump, the first 10 episodes of this podcast, what kind of books she's referring to. She's referring to books by folks like Daniel Dennett, books by folks like Steven Pinker. These are all materialists, and we were at pains to point out their scam and their ruse in those first 10 episodes of this podcast called From Darwin to Donald Trump. So if you haven't listened to that, you really need to, because they are, sorry to use an overused term, charlatans. They are liars. They are hucksters. They are con men. They are not scientific. They are philosophers pretending to be scientists. Okay? They're pushing a philosophy on you that pretends like it's a science. Okay? And acting like if you don't accept it, you're not scientific. This is the whole game. This is the racket of the left, and it's not to no point. The point is to move you away from the founding principles of this country towards socialism. And all you Christians out there who are like, well, I believe and I should just focus on the gospel. Yeah, that's great, but they're doing that so they can have a country where they can control what people say, so they can have a country where the gospel is not preached. Okay? Again, to take recourse back to that first series that we did in this podcast, episodes 1 through 10, the problem that this author is neglecting, and she herself doesn't even know that she's neglecting it, but the problem that she's neglecting is that we have absolutely no idea how the mind works. Sorry, Steven Pinker. Sorry, Daniel Dennett. Sorry, Richard Dawkins. Sorry, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Sorry, all you lose. We don't. We have no idea. We have no idea, despite all the books on cognitive science, despite all the books on neuropsychology, despite all the books on neuroscience, despite all the books on philosophy of mind, we have no idea how the mind works. The explanatory gap, and before that, Leibniz's factory or Leibniz's mill, that we just reviewed earlier, those arguments stand squarely in a none shall pass posture in the way of any objective science of the mind. Like these folks all pretend to be scientists of the mind. They're not. They're con men. Okay? Everybody who studies these things knows this. But these kind of admissions don't tend to sell many books, do they? It's much more lucrative to assure the general public that the brain sciences are really advancing with tall tales of new discoveries. And that is what the science writer exists to do, to convince you that what's going on behind closed doors in academia really is advancing the ball in some meaningful way. And then they come out here and they tell you, and therefore, like this author is telling you, you should change your political philosophy in light of it. You should become a socialist, essentially. Just watch. Don't take my word for it. Just listen. All right? That's what all these new discoveries, they're not discoveries at all, but that's what all these new discoveries are meant to move you in the direction of. And now here in this article, it's about the mind and the brain. It's not always the case, as we'll see in the next article. But I picked this one because it kind of kills two birds with one stone. It talks about an area that I think is extremely important to the game, to the battle between left and right, between conservative and liberal, between socialist and freedom-loving individual, right? And it also highlights the general tact, the general gist, the general outline, the general strategy of the science writer. Again, everyone who studies these things knows that this is a racket. All right? But the public doesn't. And the public buys the books about science because they want to know what's going on in the scientific world. God bless them, and they should. But they're being lied to. Okay? Just like we can even give this author that we're talking about here, the author of this piece, we can give her the benefit of the doubt. She's wholeheartedly gone in for what she found at the bookstore about the brain sciences and how the mind works. Maybe she doesn't even know that this is a racket. Why? I mean, that's why we have books like Dennett's Consciousness Explained and Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works. See, just look at the titles of these books. One doesn't even need to pick the book up off the shelf in order to be reassured by the experts that we've got it all figured out and we're just working out the details now. Okay? So, I mean, can you hardly blame the science writer, the science journalist, for having read none of the real material in the field? When they see titles like this, they think, well, we've got to figure out, why do I need to read this old stuff? Why do I need to read Descartes? Why do I need to read Leibniz? Why do I need to go back to the Enlightenment and read books written in the 1800s when Daniel Dennett tells me he's got it all figured out? But now observe the cost of this sort of ignorance. Watch. The important matter here is the lesson that she wishes to draw from this, quote, new research, end quote, that she has so uncritically imbibed. She begins with a provocative jab that's meant to push us over the cliff and into the exhilaration of free fall and free inquiry, or the free fall of free inquiry, right? She says, listen to this is so crucial. She says, listen to me. The point of all of this is that these folks exist in order to nudge you, in order to move you away from your core beliefs, and do it on the basis of the belief that they are telling you what science is telling us. That's why they're called science. That's why I'm calling them science writers. All right. They're reporting to you, like we heard in that clip, they're the popularizers of what's supposedly going on in the scientific world. But the game, the racket, is that what they're relating to you is not science at all. It's philosophy. And it's bogus. Okay? And there's a definite program. Again, just to go back to the largest theme of all, they hate you. They hate you because you believe in freedom. They hate you because of your beliefs about the nature of man and the beliefs about freedom that follow from those things. She says, "Who, dear reader, do you think that you are? Do you think that most of the decisions in your life have been the product of your rational, conscious self?" Oh, my daughter's back. Are you coming to find me again?
No.
What are you doing?
I
Come here, sweet pie. Give me a kiss. Give me a kiss. Mwah. I love you.
love you too.
Oh, I love you so much. Okay.
I love you so much too.
So notice the question. She says, "Who, dear reader, do you think that you are? Do you think that most of the decisions in your life have been the product of your rational conscious self?" And of course, the question is rhetorical. Why is it rhetorical? Because she does not believe, based on these new things that she's read, that they were conscious, rational decisions. Why? Because she doesn't believe in consciousness or rationality. Why? Because she doesn't believe anymore that the mind is a unique thing from the brain. Why? Because she's a materialist and she has been swayed and persuaded by materialists who assert that the mind just is the brain. Why is that relevant? Because if the mind just is the brain, then it's just a physical object amongst a bunch of other physical objects, and it's at the mercy of other physical objects via the laws of physics, and it has no unique properties and no unique powers of itself. Unique properties and powers like volition and will and freedom. You're just a cog in the machine. Who, dear reader, do you think that you are? I'm going to read the sentence again. She says, do you think that most of the decisions in your life have, and mind you, this article came out within the first year of our previous president's presidency. We're one step away from fundamentally altering America, right? She says, who, dear reader, do you think that you are? Do you think that most of the decisions in your life have been the product of your rational, conscious self? No, they haven't. It's rhetorical. Because she's about to show you to be a fool, or at least not in step with the groundbreaking research that she's in step with, for thinking that you have freely decided to do anything that you suppose that you've ever freely decided to do. And as you reel from these assumption exposing groundbreaking questions, more of them are fired across your bow. Listen to her in this article. She says, do you think that your mind is capable of independent judgment and largely directs the course of your life? Do you think that most of your decisions in life have been the product of your rational, conscious self? Do you believe you are in control of your life? Do you cherish ideas such as self-expression, sense of autonomy, and a distinct self-authored identity? She asks all these questions in a row. And obviously, all of them are meant to set you up for the knockout punch. All of this exciting new research, says the author, points to a fundamentally different conception of the human brain. Now, of course, listen, she obviously alternates between mind and brain without giving a second thought to it. What she means here is mind, but she says brain, and that just exposes her assumption, right? If you harbor any interest in holding on to these antiquated ideas about yourself, then you should be warned. They are, she says, listen to her words now, profound misunderstanding, fairy tales even. And she says, in disabusing ourselves of them, we are actually, quote, on the verge of a new enlightenment, which will actually be a new dark ages. All right. But don't miss the political application, dear reader. These antiquated assumptions that she's identifying, and they're not antiquated at all, okay? According to her view, they're antiquated because she's assuming that the brain is the mind and the mind is the brain, and all this new research means something. It doesn't. But all of these assumptions about the self, and when we say self, we mean the mind, right? All of these assumptions about the self have long been the presuppositional province of the West, of capitalism, of America, of Western culture. To be more precise, So according to the author, so see what she's doing now? According to the author, these new developments in, quote, evolutionary psychology, end quote, are forcing us to reassess our commitment to those guiding principles. In other words, are forcing us to rethink socialism. See? See how this works? To make a long story short, all of this exciting new, quote, end quote, brain research is pointing to the, quote, fact, end quote, that humans are not independent, autonomous, free decision makers, as consumer capitalism, in her language, has always supposed. Rather, we are radically social creatures whose decision faculties are primed by customs and norms. We are herd-like creatures. We are, as she says, nodes in a relationship network. And of course, for her, for the author, all of this spells good news. Why? Because, as she says, are you ready? Are you ready? She says, the regeneration of the left, the political left, the regeneration of the left requires a convincing new account of what it is to be human. All right, end quote. You see what I'm on about here? You see what I'm doing? The left has to change your idea of what it means to be a person in order to change your idea about what political philosophy you ought to hold. So they have to change your idea about what the mind is in order to change your idea about what your nature is, in order to change your idea about what the nature of society ought to be, in order to get you to accept their idea about the nature of society, which is socialism. You see? Where as in her words, market capitalism, she says, had supposed humans to be, quote, self-interested. We now know, quote, that, thanks to all this startling new brain research, that humans are actually collaborative creatures. Never mind that these two things are not distinct. Never mind all that. She just breezes over that, because one thing that you'll find with these science writers is that although they write about heady, sophisticated, nuanced topics, they possess almost no critical faculty themselves. This comes up again and again when you're reading their articles. They will regurgitate something that is loaded with assumptions, and they will not be able to identify any of them or parse any of them because they are repeaters. Okay? They're not thinkers. They're just repeaters. Okay? So you see in broad scope the point of this article. The capitalists are wrong. Western society is wrong. America is wrong. America is evil. And it's brain research that shows this. Imagine that. Imagine that. Never mind, of course, right? Never mind the obvious implication that capitalists have historically presumed that we are not collaborative creatures. Like, what the hell is that? Like, capitalism is utterly, essentially, intrinsically collaborative. Like, what are you talking about? Never mind that. Just details, right? But don't worry. And here's the crucial point, as if all this wasn't. Don't worry, dear reader, that you may not be cut out for such a thick, heavy, utter reconceiving of things, of human nature. Don't worry. Don't fear that these new insights in the brain sciences that have been unearthed are too much for you. Don't worry. Because your antiquated views of freedom and individual responsibility are just too much a part of your self-conception to be parted with. Don't worry. Don't fear. Fear not. Why should you not fear this? Because, and this is always a part, and this should scare the shit out of you. Are you ready? Because, ready? I'm going to just dwell here are you ready? Because, quote, the brain, she says, can be changed. In other words, you can be re-educated. you will always find that this is where they're going. Okay? The author even likens your previous conception of things, of the societal order. She likens it to, ready? Quote, neural damage done during childhood, of which you can be cured. You can be cured.
Please understand, we're not talking about re-education like, hey, take this class or read this book, or not that would make it, you understand? Like, I'm not saying that would like justify. I'm just saying that's not what's being referred to here. What happens when everyone starts believing that the mind is the brain and thus is just a physical object in your cranium, right? What happens when people start believing that and they get the gumption and the political authority to want to change your mind? Well, just change your brain. Right? The idea of re-education, think about it, taken in tandem with what these folks believe, that the mind is really just a piece of matter and thus is readily available to invasive procedure. You see? Please don't think I'm off and running here. I can assure you, I can prove to you that leading lights in neural philosophy and philosophy of mind, leading lights, right? These people are idiots, but they're the top philosophers in this field. Talk about what they call intervening upon the human brain to change traits, to change ideas, to change habits, to change the mind, to re-educate it. They talk about it in conferences. I can show you. Okay? You can be cured, says this stupid woman writing this stupid article in this stupid newspaper. She has probably no idea what she is letting in the door here. All right? You can be cured.
The third problem is man himself. Go on. This interests me very much. Man has got to take charge of man. That means, remember, that some men have got to take charge of the rest, which is another reason for cashing in on it as soon as one can. You and I want to be the people who do the taking charge, not the ones who are taken charge of. Quite. What sort of thing have you in mind? Well, quite simple and obvious things at first. Sterilization of the unfit, liquidation of backward races. We don't want any deadweights, selective breeding, then real education, including prenatal education. By real education, I mean one that has no take-it-or-leave-it nonsense. A real education makes the patient what it wants infallibly, whatever he or his parents try to do about it. Of course, it will have to be mainly psychological at first, but we'll get on to biochemical conditioning in the end and direct manipulation of the brain.
All right. Just a little fictional illustration for you there. Listen. Like I said, not all of these science writer pieces that I want to show you are going to be about the mind and brain. It's really more about the style of the article that we're looking at and what it's trying to accomplish. But it is important here that the two are married, okay? And I hope you see that. I hope you see the reason for the marriage. The reason, in other words, I hope you see the reason that theorizing about the mind and brain and convincing the public of certain conclusions and theories about the mind and the brain is important to the political left. All right? Should we just do the whole philosophy thing all over it, like back from the first series where we just run through the order of the question? Look. If we want to know what kind of thing man is, that's a metaphysical question, right? If we want to know that, if we want to know the metaphysics, want to get the metaphysics right, then we got to be clear on what sort of method is correct for identifying an answer to that question. Getting clear on that method is the epistemological question, right? And if we want to know how we ought to compose our society politically, how we ought to arrange ourselves, that's an ethical, moral, political question. That's ethical philosophy, right? But in order to know that, we have to have some idea of what individuals ought to do and ought not to do. See how politics dissolves into ethics? All right? Moreover, if we're going to get an accurate answer to that question about how we ought to behave as individuals and then thus as groups and then thus how we ought to reserve the right to coerce each other to behave, which is politics, then we have to know what kind of things we are. That's metaphysics again. All right? So they're all three, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. They all run together. Okay? Now ask yourself the following question. Remember what she said. The regeneration of the left requires a convincing new account of what it means to be human. So ask yourself the following question. If you wanted to fundamentally alter, like that previous president of ours said, fundamentally change, right? If you wanted to fundamentally change the political structure of a society, without a great deal of bloodshed and chaos, how would you do it? The answer is ready to hand. You first try to alter the society's conception of itself. And you do this by altering the individual's conception of their own nature. That is, what kind of thing he or she is. The writer of the article couldn't have been more clear. She asked, remember, who, dear reader, do you think you are? And then she gave away the game in the very title and the subtitle of her piece. Our ideas of brain and human nature are myths. The notion of individual autonomy that underpins our society, i.e. underpins Western capitalistic Christian society, right? And Christians, don't get your panties in a bunch when I mention Christianity with capital. Oh, Christianity has nothing to do with capital. Yes, it does. All right? I'm not saying that the two are the same. I'm saying you don't get a system like capitalism and the flourishing of human personality and well-being that it allows for. You don't get that until you make certain assumptions about mankind, assumptions which only make sense if you assume that the Christian picture of the world is correct. All right? They go hand in hand. That's why when folks try to tell you that the Enlightenment is what produced Western society, they're wrong, incidentally. It's not the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment would have ended up in totalitarianism, just like ancient Greece would have ended up in the Far East. Just like the Pythagoreans would have just become the Buddhists. Okay, it's the same. It was Christian. It was the Protestant Reformation that produced Western society as we know it. Anyway, she couldn't have been more clear, right? She says it. Who do you think you are? She puts it in her title. Our ideas of brain and human nature are myths. The notion of individual autonomy underpins our society, yet, and here's the science writer move, yet new research, none of which she can assimilate in her own mind, she's just a repeater, new research suggests, right? No, it doesn't, but she's too stupid to recognize this. New research suggests that this guiding principle is an illusion. All right, this is the science writer setup. I want to choose this piece here. Look, please, do you understand why this is important? The secularization of society depends on the secularization of political life. The secularization of political life depends on the secularization of that domain of knowledge which most informs a politically advanced society. Which domain of knowledge is that? Science. And thus it depends upon those who interpret and explain science to the society at large. The science writers, the professors, but most popularly the science writers, the popularizers. All right? And for the purpose of political and societal remaking, the secularization of science depends on the secularization of the object, the fundamental unit of societal and political life. Hey, Nick, what's that? It's the individual. Who, dear reader, do you think that you are? See? In order to materialize or secularize the individual, the nature of the individual must be materialized and secularized. The nature of the individual is and lies in its mind. That's what makes us what we are. So in order to secularize society thoroughly, the nature of the mind must be rendered material. No matter how thoroughly the theoretical attempts to do that fail. And they have failed. For 100 years, they failed. I can take you through the history of philosophy. They failed. There's no plausible theory whereby the mind is the brain. They don't care. This chick doesn't care. She doesn't know, right? She's a science writer. She's going to tell you about all this research that's being done in the brain sciences that tell her, and she's telling you, that you should be a socialist. The regeneration of the left requires a convincing new account of what it is to be human. All right? All right? So I hope it's clear. We'll have more to say about this. I'm going to do a whole series called, well, I'll tell you what's going to be called later on. I'm going to do a whole series on the mind. Okay? But I hope it's clear what the game is here of the science writer. What they do. They say, heretofore, we've always thought this, right? But here, let me tell you about all this startling new research in such and such a field that is leading us to believe that this, right? And notice, they go on, once you really look at what this is telling us, look how it forces us to reconsider all these things that we formerly held dear. But it always turns out that the things that they want you to disabuse yourself of, that you formerly held dear, are intrinsically tied to things like freedom, capitalism, Christianity, right? Free society, the civil society, all those things. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? Damn right it's interesting. That's why you listen to the podcast. My name is Nick. It's 40 Days on Block Podcast. See you in the next episode.